I will read the title, Domain Analytic and Domain Analytic-Like Studies of Catalog Needs. Part of my question is, am I really doing domain analysis? So I hope we talk about that. Addressing the ethical dilemma of catalog codes developed with inadequate knowledge of user needs. My name's Maurine McCourry. I'm an adjunct instructor of cataloging at Dominican University, but my full-time job is as a technical services librarian at Hillsdale College in Michigan. So the idea with this paper is partly to summarize my dissertation research. I completed my dissertation last summer. I want to explore ways to strengthen this research's affiliation with the domain analytic paradigm. And I also want to explore ways to disseminate this kind of research to produce actionable data that will improve descriptive cataloging, meeting the needs of diverse populations of users. I'm not sure we're doing that right now with current cataloging. But who says that catalogs need to meet user needs? We're going to have some discussion in the next two presentations about our ethics as catalogers. But we already have the ALA Code of Ethics, which says that librarians provide the highest level of service to all library users through appropriate and usefully organized resources. And so I take that to imply cataloging. Baer, in 2005, with her Code of Ethics for Cataloging, addressed some of these issues, and Bade in 2002 and in 2009, with his discussion of problems with misinformation, discussed some of it too, and then Bechtel in 2008 called for dialogue on these issues. And it's my assumption, I might be making too much of an assumption, but it's my assumption that the first of these conferences was, at least in part, a response to Bechtel's call for dialogue on ethics in knowledge organization. At that conference, Maraya suggested studies to quantify the limitations of the catalog vis-a-vis its inability to accommodate cultural warrant and, in turn, domain specificity and activity theory. And Hoffman suggested domain analysis as detailed in Herlin and Albertson's 1995 article and in Herlin's 2002 article as framework for the empirical studies of domains of users to improve catalog codes. And so that's what I built my dissertation on, primarily on Gretchen Hoffman's idea that we could use this framework, this viewpoint, to study users in a more effective way. So this all has to do with RDA, which we heard about yesterday some, the most recent standard for cataloging in libraries, resource description and access. It was adopted by LC in March of 2013 and by most libraries following LC's example since. It's based on IFLA's FRBR, Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records, a model of the way people use information. The question that Gretchen Hoffman had was FRBR really developed with empirical evidence of user needs? And yes, I was not able to find, she was not able to find evidence that it was, and I was not able to find evidence either. I think she was right that there wasn't enough empirical work done to discover what users need. In 2010 and 2012, Pazanski and Zoomer did publish work demonstrating that the kind of post-haste, that the model that FRBR does represent what they call the mental models of the bibliographic universe. So they did some card sorting type studies and other studies of user needs and determined that, yeah, FRBR pretty much fits this. But we really need a lot more of studies of users, and I think we really need to study users away from existing catalogs. The research questions I'm hoping to address with this paper are, can studies of small domains of users help to solve the ethical dilemma of cataloging codes created with limited empirical knowledge of user needs? To what extent should such studies be methodologically aligned with previous domain analytic investigations in knowledge organization? And what evidence exists to suggest that RDA, the current standard, should serve users of all types? And what's the role of ethics in any such suggestion? And I dealt with all this in my dissertation, but this is much more focusing on how I can bring this research out and continue it. So ethics and catalog user studies have always kind of gone together, even before Durbin and Nyland's noting of a paradigm shift from focus on the system to focus on the user. Cutter, even in the early 20th century, noted that the convenience of the public is always to be set before the ease of the cataloger. This is kind of a summary of my literature review, basically. Randall in 1930 called for user studies on catalog use, and one of the first of those was Ackers in 1931, who looked at card catalog use by liberal arts college students, which is similar to what I did. Markey in 1980 was a literature review, and she documented lots and lots of user studies of catalog use. And then by Brownrigg and Lawrence in 1982, we were looking at OPAC use. But all of these studies really were looking at the use of existing catalogs. They were asking users how they used existing catalogs, maybe how they could use them more effectively, how those catalogs could work better. But it was still, at least in my perspective, it was still looking at user needs in terms of existing systems. It was not looking at user needs and then trying to create systems that match those needs. And this, I think, is even true of more recent. Catalog use studies have kind of shifted to a more qualitative model. So the more recent studies have been more qualitatively focused. Novotny and Hyder and Tan and Zhang and Novotny, as recent as 2008, were all qualitative studies, but they still were asking questions in reference to the existing system. So I really think we need to find a way to study users as much as possible without referencing existing systems. So I propose a model. And I base this model on domain analysis as a theoretical framework, as a viewpoint, according to Herlin and Albrechtson's 1995 article, which suggests we consider domains rather than individuals in LIS studies. And it really recalls, they don't really talk so much about Bloomer explicitly and symbolic interactionism, but it really recalls those sociological ideals, that the social is important, which is no news to this crowd. In my view, a robust cognitive study would, of course, consider multiple users. You would look at lots and lots of people to create a really robust cognitive study of individual use. And so it follows to me that a robust sociocognitive study, a robust domain analytic study, would consider multiple domains. And so what I've done, and I quote Tennis, I'm not sure how accurately, this is kind of a paraphrase, he calls cognitive studies cumulative, that we would want to do a cumulative study to get a complete picture of user needs. My study in my dissertation was really only one part of a complete study. I only looked at one domain. So it's kind of a start to the research and definitely not an end. I see this as an ongoing and iterative process that would gradually, if it was continued in the same vein, would gradually complete the picture to some extent, as much as possible. So what I did, my methodology in my dissertation was to define a domain narrowly to operationalize, and this is another concept that is somewhat taken from Tennis's 2003 article. I identified 136 students in this domain, and the domain was music, students enrolled in applied music classes at a small liberal arts college. So these were not necessarily music majors and minors, they were people enrolled in music lessons for credit toward their bachelor's degree. It was a very small university. I limited my range of possible universities to consider to schools that had fewer than 1,750 students, so very small liberal arts colleges. And so the school that I ended up using as the model study, there were only 136 students enrolled in the fall semester of last year in applied music courses. So that was my domain. So I surveyed the domain with a mixed method, with mixed methods to determine elements. And I say bibliographic information, this is really elements of information, bibliographic kind of in a large sense, but I'm becoming more aware of bibliographic centrism, bibliocentrism, and so I'm not sure that's really the correct term, but I sent out a questionnaire to the full domain and got 38 responses. I did 7 half-hour interview sessions with students from the same domain, and then I did a focus group, a 1-hour focus group with 5 of the students, which really I highly recommend. It's a very rich methodology. I got so much great information from the focus group. I analyzed the textual data with simple content analysis as described by Weber in 1990, and then I mapped the analyzed needed elements to RDA. This is just an example of my survey questions. I'll read this first one. When you come to the library or to the library website looking for sound recordings, CDs for example, to support your college-level music studies, what information do you bring about the materials you need? In other words, what information might you already have about those needed recordings? List any words you can think of to describe that information. And when I was trying to wordsmith this with my committee, we toyed with the use of words like keywords and, for example, title, et cetera, and decided that was too much leading information, and that what we really wanted to get was, we wanted to get as far away from existing terminology as possible and get the language of the users, and that's what I was looking for. And so this questioning, after some pilot studies, this line worked out pretty well in getting the kind of information I was looking at. And I did the same type of question for various formats that students in a music class might be using. And then I followed it up with questions about how they use other information sources like Amazon or Google, and how that compared to what they did in a library, and then just a couple of demographic questions. The interview questions were based on the survey questions, survey questionnaire, but I got into a little bit more depth. These were the one-on-one interviews, and so I was able to suggest that they bring an example of information they might have been looking for to support their music studies, and to talk about that. Some of this was actually built on Jihee's dissertation. She asked students to bring information, or to describe materials, and so I kind of took a little bit of that idea for this study. It was very helpful, and they came up with some really good descriptive terms of what they were looking for. And then, kind of along the same lines with the rest of the interview questions. And then the focus group questions, too, again, built on the same kind of thing. With the focus group, I brought materials to them and asked the group to describe the materials, which had the same type of effect of having them use their own language to talk about what kind of information they would look for. But I got the feedback with the students kind of feeding off of each other it was fascinating to me. So when I went through this content analysis to code the terms and to find out what terms they had used, ended up with a list of 96 elements of information that these students needed in a library catalog. And so I mapped those determined needs to RDA instructions, one by one. So that was kind of the bulk of the analytic work of the dissertation. When I did that, it's not showing the values. That's very interesting. I'll try to remember. It was something like, out of the 96 elements of information that they mentioned, something like 30 some odd were included in RDA instructions, in the core RDA instructions. And so I'll have to send this chart out, because it's very interesting when it has the labels. Well, it's down at the bottom. It's down at the bottom. So the stuff in orange was included in the RDA core instructions, and so you could expect that most library catalogs would include those elements of information, and so that stuff would be covered. The next group, the stuff in gray, is included in the Music Library Association's best practices document for working with RDA. So in a music library, at least, you could expect that this turns out to be 52%. If you combine the stuff in MLA and the stuff in the core, the RDA core, you come up with 52% of these students' determined needs to be covered by RDA instruction. So that leaves 48% of the stuff they said they needed out of a library catalog not being covered by RDA, which seems like a lot. And this is not a statistically significant study. We can't say, oh, all students in this domain need this amount of information, but it gives us a clue that maybe if we continue doing this kind of studies, if we get this kind of results from other domains, other similar studies, might indicate there's a problem and we need to cover more user needs in RDA. The stuff in yellow was stuff that was in RDA but not in the core, and so most libraries probably wouldn't have the time to realistically include too much of that information. And the stuff in blue was actually not included in any RDA instruction. That was actually 14 of the 96, so kind of a significant amount of information that these students need that wasn't even in RDA. So in terms of refining the model, in terms of previous domain analytic investigations, I think this is supported, this use of domain analysis is supported, at least in Herlin and Albrechtson's early article, but Han Albrechtson, I saw on ResearchGate, is coming out with an article called "This is Not Domain Analysis." And as far as I can determine, she is going to talk about the use of domain analysis as a theoretical framework, and so I'm very interested to see what she has to say about that. I think I might have to tweak my terminology a little bit. I'm interested to hear what Richard has to say too. But domain analysis, they said in 1995, building on the more sociocultural, pragmatic, and realistic theories of cognition, represents an alternative theory to the cognitive phenomena. In this respect, domain analysis and cognitivism are not two supplementary points of view, but are two mutually exclusive theoretical points of view. And so in my opinion then, domain analysis, if we're going to use it as a viewpoint, as a theoretical framework, it has to apply to all types of LIS studies. Not everyone is a member of an academic discipline. If we're going to say domain analysis only applies to studying academic disciplines, leaves a whole lot of people out. My use of the term domain, at least until now, has been that anyone, any group of people could be a domain. Children, as Jihi had studied, parents may be a domain, people identifying as a particular gender might be a domain, participants in particular activities, and this actually was supported by Herlin's response to a question at a conference in 2004, where he said that no, any claim that domain analysis is only concerned with academic subjects is not true. And so he actually addressed this 10 years ago or so. What I want to do in terms of disseminating this model is to answer the questions in this paper as a start. Eventually I want to pursue publication of a practitioner-focused article for replicating the study with other domains. Try to make it into simple steps that you can follow. Ask this kind of questions, do this kind of thing, and then eventually, too, I'd like to, as a community, pursue changes to RDA based on the accumulated data regarding domain-specific user needs. Applying this data to an ethical purpose, I don't think we should pursue separate codes for separate domains. This is one of Gretchen Hoffman's suggestions. But in looking at it now, after looking at a little bit of data, I'm not sure that's the most practical way to go, especially the way RDA is structured, where it's a dynamic online document meant to not be necessarily read through cover to cover, as it were, but to be used as a reference. I think adding to that probably is the most practical way to go. And I think also the encouragement of the development of linked data formats for catalog that will allow catalogers to share metadata without entering it over and over again. If we asked catalogers to create these huge long records that would serve every domain, that would be unrealistic. But I think in the linked data environment, we might be able to do some of this. So to answer my questions, I do think that this kind of study can help us determine get us to empirical knowledge of user needs to improve catalog codes. I do think that my work probably should be more aligned with the domain analytic paradigm, with the existing literature. Like I say, I'm looking forward to some suggestions on doing that. And I think that because RDA is the accepted standard for library cataloging, it has to serve all users. I don't think there's really any choice that it doesn't. User studies have to be done, and I believe a socio-cognitive paradigm will ensure that those studies reflect diverse user needs. Thank you very much.